There are certain beliefs in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that often cause people to leave the church. Some of these ideas are taught over the pulpit by the church leaders. Of all of the teachings that cause people to leave, there's one that I see happening the most often, that causes the most problems, the most cognitive dissonance, and that ex-Mormons quote the most. This is the idea that the prophet will never say anything wrong. Doctrinally, we don't believe that. In the history of the church, there's a quote from Joseph Smith that says, "I will give you a key that will never rust. If you will stay with the majority of the 12 apostles and the records of the church, you will never be led astray." Did Joseph Smith teach that? Actually, no. Well, maybe. It's secondhand information. It says here, Joseph Smith never wrote it down himself in his sermons or official writings. Instead, it comes from a later recollection recorded by William G. Nelson, 36 years after Joseph Smith's death. Some information about William G. Nelson. He was never a prominent leader, not in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, not a general authority. He was a somewhat obscure person who recounted something from 36 years earlier that supposedly Joseph Smith said. But other church leaders following Joseph Smith have said similar things. Wilford Woodruff shared his opinion and said, "The Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not the mind of God. If we were to attempt it, the Lord would remove me out of my place. And so he will any other man who attempts to lead the children of men astray from the oracles of God and from their duty." Harold B. Lee said something interesting that actually kind of contradicts this. He says, "You keep your eye on the president of the church, and if he ever tells you to do anything, and it is wrong, and you do it, the Lord will bless you for it." So he's actually saying that they can say something wrong. But he's saying if they do, that the Lord will bless you for following the prophet anyways. He goes on to say, "The Lord won't ever let his mouthpiece lead this people astray." And Ezra Taft Benson said, "The prophet will never lead the church astray." President Wilford Woodruff stated, and he quotes Wilford Woodruff. Spencer W. Kimball said, "There is carefully charted course from which we must not deviate. The Lord will not let the leaders of this church lead you astray." And this was also reiterated by President Nelson recently. Well, people hear this, and then they think they know what it means. And then they encounter some instance where a church leader said something wrong. Brigham Young taught something called the Adam God theory. This is now called by the church a false doctrine. Brigham Young taught something called the blood atonement. And this was that some people's sins were so bad they needed to die for it. The church now calls this a false doctrine, saying Christ's atonement is enough. Joseph Fielding Smith and Spencer W. Kimball both condemned any form of birth control. Now the church encourages people to prayerfully approach this topic and do what they feel is right. Brigham Young instituted something that did not allow black men to hold the priesthood or to go through the temple endowment. Now the church has released a statement disavowing racist policies and past racist explanations that were given by the church leaders. Oliver B. Huntington recorded that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young both taught that the moon was inhabited by people who looked like Quakers. Of note, Oliver B. Huntington wrote this down 48 years after Joseph Smith's death, and Oliver B. Huntington was not a church leader. So it's very possible that 48 years later, his recollection of things was not accurate, as we know that human memory is not fully reliable. There's no record that we can see that's contemporary ever stating that Joseph Smith or Brigham Young taught that there were people living on the moon. It's possible that he said, maybe there are people living on the moon. Maybe they look like this. And then 48 years later, he remembered it different from what they said. But I'm making these points for two main reasons. First of all, if you think that some church leader has said something and it appears to be wrong, maybe make sure that they actually said it. Because recollecting something from 40 years later is not very reliable. So if it's not church doctrine, you could probably just throw it out as assuming maybe this isn't very reliable. And I shouldn't hang my testimony on whatever this is. So it's actually a doctrinal principle that the church leaders are not infallible, that they can say things that are wrong. that they don't know everything, they are not omniscient, that they do have their own opinions and their own bias. So how do we fit that together with all these quotes about the prophet never leading you astray? Didn't we just establish that like 5 church leaders all said that we'll never be led astray by any of the church leaders? Maybe the idea of them being infallible is not the same idea of someone being led astray. Let me explain. First of all, the statement that the prophet will never lead you astray is not a revelation. If you were to classify it as something, you might say it's a pastoral reassurance. Leaders, church leaders, explain it like this. Prophets won't lead the entire church into apostasy. God's overall plan for the church won't be derailed. The church and the priesthood will not be taken from the earth. God's not going to cast you into outer darkness because you are trying to follow the prophet. That's what you can understand by not being led astray. If you understood the word not be led astray as to mean that the church leader is infallible, that they will never say anything wrong, that they will never demonstrate some kind of bias, that all of their personal opinions are absolutely perfectly correct. If that's what you thought that meant, then you were mistaken. The thing about language is that it can mean lots of things. It's a terrible way of communicating, but it's the only way that we have. I wish that every time a church leader would say that the president will never lead people astray, or the prophet will never lead people astray, that they would explain what they mean by that a little bit. To say, not that I can never make a mistake, not that I'm omniscient, not that I'm infallible, but that God's not going to allow the church to be taken from the earth again. And if you're truly striving to follow God by listening to the prophets, God's not going to send you into outer darkness, cast you into hell for eternity for striving to follow God's prophet. So let's play the what if game for a second. What if Joseph Smith committed a terrible sin? What if he committed adultery? What if his own lusts drove him to create polygamy? Well, this happened anciently with King David, who was presiding over the 12 tribes of Israel. He committed adultery, and he also practiced polygamy. Abraham also practiced polygamy, and maybe that was bad too. If this happened, the individual would be held accountable for it before God, but the church would not be taken from the earth. Another narrative that I've heard recently, some people say, well, actually it looks like Brigham Young was the one that introduced polygamy. And John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff and those that followed sort of just followed the traditional teachings that he gave until it was removed from the church. Maybe they thought it was the right thing, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe they told some lies. Maybe they remembered some things wrong. Does that mean the church is false? Well, here's the thing. This isn't the church of Brigham Young or John Taylor or Wilford Woodruff or even of Joseph Smith. This is the church of Jesus Christ. And he has put the stewardship in the hands of men. And these leaders are called, and it is their responsibility to lead the church. It's their stewardship. And doctrinally, we understand that they are not perfect. But God will not allow them to utterly destroy the church. So whether they messed up on Adam-God theory or blood atonement or blacks in the priesthood, I admit that's a really big mess up. Or even polygamy, which would be a monumental mess up. And whether they committed adultery or even unalived someone in the bad way, like King David, that's between them and God. God doesn't take away their agency. God doesn't make them omniscient. He doesn't make them infallible. He doesn't prevent them from sinning. And their personal mishaps and sins, and whatever policies they instituted that may have been in bad, don't unmake this the Church of Jesus Christ. Anyways, this topic is the topic that I find most often that most people who leave the church, ex-Mormons, have struggled with. Like, wait a second, I thought the church leader would never lead us astray, and then here they messed up on something. They're very strong on this, but it's a hard kind of strong, the fragile kind, like tempered glass. Tiny little stone strikes it and the whole thing just goes up and cracks, shatter and fall to the ground. Because this perspective is utterly inflexible. It is a black or white, all or nothing kind of approach. And it even contradicts itself. So if you have this viewpoint, I encourage you to abandon it if you're a member of the church. The doctrine is that they are fallible, but God won't allow them to destroy the church. Or no one will be sent to outer darkness for following them. But policies can be bad and things can be wrong. And in time, it'll fix itself. We are still being proved as a people and as a church. The church is not done being restored yet. Flexibility is another kind of strength.